In the last video, we talked about for loops. For each loop just like that is used to repeatedly execute a block of code. Now, since for loops and for each loops are so similar, of course there are some differences between them. The first difference is that for each can be less intimidating to beginners, as when they first look at it, the loop syntax for the for each loop almost looks like an English sentence. While for loops can be intimidating because it looks like you're going to start doing some math problem. This of course makes most people feel at home when using for each loops, and within seconds they fall in love with its simplicity and throw for loop in the back of the closet and forget about it. Now some of you might have heard the saying that there is a right tool for every job. And that is quite true in this case. But there is a caveat, and that is, it depends on the person doing the job what the right tool is. Every coder will have his or her idiosyncrasy, and even though it does matter which loop you use where, it's a matter of optimization. And as a complete beginner, at least until you have a strong enough base in programming, you don't need to think about which loop to use, and just use whichever one you feel more comfortable using. If you want to know my idiosyncrasy, when working with things that have indexes, like arrays, I like using for loops, as for me it's just easier. While when working with things like lists, dictionaries, or collections, I like using for each loops, as it does a much better job for that workload. So when and how to use either of these loops is really dependent on the coder and what they are comfortable using. Sadly, for loops just look more intimidating to newcomers, and a lot of beginners might find it a bit cumbersome to use as opposed to for each loops, so they just never try using it. The next difference is that for loop needs us to tell it where it starts and where it ends when you set it up, while for each loops, just like its name suggests, loops through each and every element of an array, list, dictionary, or collection that you are iterating over. Another difference is that in for loops, you can initialize multiple variables when you set up the loops, while this is not possible in for each loops. With that done, let's move on to the syntax of the for each loop and break it down into sections. First of all, we have for each and the two parentheses, which tells the compiler that we are writing the for each loop. Then we have the data type and name of the local variable that we are declaring. This local variable is what we would be using to store the members that we are accessing from the array, list, dictionary, or collection that we are iterating over. So if we are iterating over a string array, then the data type that we should use for the local variable is string. Now, instead of strongly typing the data type like this, you can also use the var keyword and let the compiler decide what is the suitable data type for your local variable based on the data that you are placing inside it. If you use the var keyword, what you should make sure is that you name the variable correctly with a descriptive name so that you can infer what data is inside the variable, as if it is not named correctly, it will be really bothersome to decipher what the variable refers to. Another important thing to remember is that in C#, var is strongly typed. Once it is declared and initialized, its data type cannot be changed. There is a huge debate on whether you should use or not use the var keyword, and to that I would say, do what you are comfortable with if you are working on the project alone. But of course, don't forget to follow a rough naming scheme and coding style so that it is easy for you to go through your own code. While if you are working in a team, make a guideline on how things will be named and whether all of you will be clearly mentioning the data types or not. Make this guideline rigid and follow it, because now there are too many cooks working on this project, and if you don't do it, there will definitely be trouble down the road. This sort of conventions are important and will help maintain consistency so that anyone on your team with basic programming knowledge can read through the code and understand it. Or if a new person joins the team, all you need to do is give him or her this piece of guidelines and conventions, and they can be up and running quickly. Moving forward, now comes the third section, which is the array, list, dictionary, or collection that you are going through. And the final section is everything inside the curly braces, that is the code block. Now let's move on to my favorite part of the video, it's RPG analogy time. For today's analogy, let's go with something that's a bit smaller than the one in the last video. Think about a battle scene in your game where the player and his allies are fighting with the enemy while the neutrals are waiting on the sideline. Now the player wants to use an area of effect or AoE attack, but let's say the AoE attack is kinda sentient and will only attack the enemies. So what we have to do as the god of creation is write the code that will find all the enemies within the range of our AoE attack and inflict damage on them, while not inflicting any damage on the neutrals and the allies. That's it. Now, to test this scenario, we would first need an array that contains the name of all the factions. Then another array that will contain the names of all the NPCs. We'll be giving NPCs unique name and will suffix the names with their faction. By doing this, we would not need to create another array to store whether the NPC is an ally, enemy, or neutral. Next, we'll create another array that will store whether the NPC is within the range of the AoE attack or not. With just these three arrays and a couple of variables, we'd be able to code this AoE attack. So let's get started with the code. First of all, let's display the names of the three factions. To do that, let's declare a string array named underscore factions with 3 members and set the values to .ally, .enemy, and .neutral. After that, let's go to the start method and create a for each loop. Inside the brackets, we will use the var keyword to initialize the local variable named faction that will take the data from underscore factions array. Now, inside the curly braces, let's create a conditional block using if with the conditions being faction equal to .ally. If this returns true, then debug.log ally faction. Next is the else if block with the condition being faction equal to .enemy. If this returns true, then debug.log enemy faction. And the last else if block with the condition being faction equal to .neutral. If this returns true, then debug.log neutral faction. And that's it. Now let's go to Unity and check the logs. As you can see, we debug.log the 3 factions. Now I don't think that I need to break this piece of code down, as it is pretty simple. So let's move forward and complete the whole code for our AoE attack. To do that, first we need to create a string array named underscore NPCs with 7 members and set the values to those members like this: Zane.ally, Connor.enemy, Delilah.neutral, Deborah.ally, Seth.enemy, Alex.neutral, Wolf.enemy. With that done, let's create a bool array named underscore with an AoE range with 7 members. And set the values to those members like this: true, true, false, 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 true, true. Now in the start method, let's create 3 variables, all of type integer, with names ally found, enemy found, and neutral found, and set all of them to 0. With that done, inside the if block of the ally faction, create another int named I and set it to 0. After that, create a for each loop to iterate over underscore NPCs array. Then, inside the curly braces, create a compound if condition where the first condition is npc.ends with opening bracket faction closing bracket. This means that if the string inside the npc variable has .li at its end, then it will return true, otherwise it will return false. And the second condition is underscore within AOE range I equal to true, which is us checking whether the NPC is within the AOE attack's range or not. And because we use the logical AND operator to join these conditions, only if both the conditions return true will we be able to execute the code within this if block. Now, if we are inside the if block, that means that we have found an ally. So let's increase the value of ally found by 1 and then debug.log ally plus ally found plus empty space plus npc plus hp colon 100 minus 0 equal to 100. And after the if statement, increase the value of I by 1 so that we'd be able to get the correct data from underscore within AOE range array for the next NPC in the next loop cycle. Now let's copy and paste everything we have inside the ally factions if block into the neutral and enemy factions if block. And change every place that we have written ally to neutral in the neutral factions if block like this. With that done, now inside the enemy factions if block, do the same, but instead change it to enemy in place of ally like this. We are able to do this because the only difference that will be between the factions will be inside the innermost if block, and the code structure will remain the same before it. Now inside the innermost if block of the enemy factions if block, we have incremented the enemy found variable by 1. Now we need to apply damage to the enemy's HP, so let's create another integer named random damage and use random.range to generate a random number between 10 and 100 like this. After that, let's debug.log enemy plus enemy found plus empty space plus npc plus hp colon 100 minus plus random damage plus equal to plus bracket 100 minus random damage closing bracket. And with that, the code for our AOE attack is finally complete. Now let's break down this piece of code. First, we declared and initialized 3 arrays and set their values. Then in the start method, we created 3 member counting variables and set them to 0. After that, we have the Foreach loop, which is looping over the underscore factions array. Actually, we could have done this without using the factions array, but I wanted to show you nested Foreach loops, so we did this extra steps. After that, inside the Foreach loop, we created an if condition to separate the NPCs by faction. After that, inside each faction, we initialized a variable I and set it to 0. Then we created a nested Foreach loop inside each faction to loop over the underscore NPCs array. And for each NPC that we looped over, we checked 2 things. First, if the data inside the NPC variable ends with the correct faction name. And second, if the NPC is within the range of the attack. If both these conditions return true, then based on the faction, we increase the member counting variable by 1. After that, for the factions that will not be affected by the AOE attack, that is the ally and the neutral faction, we directly debug.logged that there is no damage inflicted. While for the enemy faction, we generated a random damage value and used it to simulate that the enemy was hit with an attack, and debug.logged the newly calculated HP for the enemy. With that done, let's go to Unity and check the logs. As you can see, the logs are showing correctly based on the factions, and only logging the NPCs that are within the range of the AoE attack. Well, that does it for today's video. If you like the content, I hope that you will subscribe to the channel. Do comment below if you have any doubts or if you just want to share your thoughts. And as always, if you see someone struggling down in the comment section, do try and help them. Goodbye for now. This is your host VP signing off.